I'm James Evans. I'm the Environmental Policy Director here at SECF. Ryan Orgera, our CEO, is running a little late and asked if I would just go ahead and kick off this morning's presentations. I do want to recognize a few folks that we have in the audience today. We have a few of our board members. We have Ty Simrosky, Dick Pyle, and we have Chip Roach. And we also have one of our council members, John Henshaw, in the audience. So everybody want to give them a round of applause for being here this morning? Thank you. For those of you that that weren't here last night, which it looks like everybody in the audience was here last night, but it was announced that I'm going to be the new CEO to succeed Ryan Orgera. So super excited to lead this organization and continue the great partnership we have with the University of Florida Center for Coastal Solutions. This is such a great partnership, and we're doing a lot of great work that you're going to hear about here today. And just couldn't be more excited to take the helm of this great organization. I do want to thank all of you for coming here today to hear about all of the great work that the students have been working on, and in collaboration with our scientists here at SECF. And our partnership with the Center for Coastal Solutions is really it's really critical in developing the important science that we need to solve our water quality issues here in the Caloosahatchee, Charlotte Harbor, and in our coastal waters around Sanibel and Captiva Islands. And as you may know, our water quality issues have a direct impact on the ecology of our waters, the quality of life of our residents and those folks living on and around the islands, as well as our local economy. We have a tourism-based economy that generates about $3 billion a year annually, and without good water quality, without our world-class beaches, without our world-class fisheries, we wouldn't have the people investing in this area like they do today. And so I just want to mention that this work is really an investment in our future, and we have brought the best and brightest people, many of you sitting here today, to study our waters, and just couldn't be more excited to work with you into the future. With that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Christine Angelini, the Director of the Center for Coastal Solutions and Associate Professor with the Environmental Engineering Sciences at the University of Florida, and Tom Ankerson, who's Professor in the University of Florida Levin College of Law. Christine?
Good morning, everyone. I'm just going to say good morning, and I'm really going to hand this over to Tom because we decided he was going to MC this morning, and so I think he'll give you kind of a better overview. But just wanted to say good morning to everyone, and I appreciate you coming and spending the morning with us.
Okay, thanks. Christy and I, being professors, we're used to shouting in classrooms, so the mic really isn't necessary, but we'll make it work. So what we're going to do, we have 4 projects, essentially, that we will present over the course of the next couple of hours. The idea is that each presentation will be about 20 minutes, and then we'll have some 10 minutes for questions and answers. So I'll ask Christine, if you don't mind, to keep us on track in terms of how we're doing on time and so forth. And that will be it, the 4 presentations. Everybody was here last night, but I'll just review it. We'll start by talking about the Sanibel Plan and its relationship to climate change and sea level rise in particular. In fact, that's the main focus of that. We'll be discussing mangrove protection and mangrove trimming law. We will have a discussion of the interior canal water quality on Sanibel and what some nature-based solutions that might be applicable to improve the quality of those waters. And we will be discussing the erosion protection on the island of Captiva and opportunities that this special district has that's somewhat unique, the Captiva Erosion Protection District, to work in that resilient space, and also some obstacles to those opportunities that can be overcome. We also presented yesterday to the West Coast Inland Navigation District on a project involving dredging and how dredging can be not just more environmentally friendly, but perhaps proactively environmentally friendly in several different ways. We presented that yesterday, so if there's time, we'll have maybe a brief summary of that. But other than that, that's how we're going to go. So we're going to roll first with the Sanibel Plan project, and Katie Gwynn is going to start. I'm assisting her in this. She got divided between 2 projects, so she didn't have a partner, so I became her partner in this project for part of it. So Katie, come on up.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for being here. My name is Katie Gwynn. I'm a third-year law student at the University of Florida Levin College of Law, And like Professor Ankerson said, I've been working with his help and guidance on the Sanibel Plan project, where we were asked to create revisions and amendments to the Sanibel Plan so that it specifically addresses climate change and sea level rise. And for this presentation, we've focused on sea level rise specifically. So just a brief overview of what we're going to discuss in this presentation. We're going to go through a quick history of some important sea level rise legislation that's been passed in Florida over the past decade or so, and then we'll dive more deeply into what our exact task was that we were assigned. I'll discuss the process that we use to complete this project, and then we'll end with some suggested goals and objectives and policies that we have for the Sanibel Plan that focus on the natural environment, the built environment, and bringing the Sanibel Plan into compliance with the Peril of Flood Statute, which I'll discuss a little bit later. So sea level rise is a term that I'm sure we're all very familiar with and comfortable using now, but for a long time and until recently that wasn't the case. Comprehensive plans across the state did not begin using the term sea level rise until quite recently. One of the first comprehensive plans in the state to include the terms climate change and sea level rise specifically was Punta Gorda through provisions drafted by the UF Law Conservation Clinic. So here is just the actual language from the Punta Gorda plan. You can see where they do specifically address climate change and sea level rise. And then some counties, such as Broward County, have entire elements dedicated to climate change. So just two examples of how climate change and sea level rise have been implemented recently across the state. There have been several laws recently created in Florida that discuss sea level rise. I've listed them here at the bottom. I'm going to briefly go through them just very quickly to explain kind of how they include sea level rise and sort of why they're important for contextualizing how sea level rise and climate change can, and in some cases must be, included in comprehensive plans. So in 2006, the Coastal Properties Disclosure Statement law was created, which requires sellers of property located within coastal areas to inform purchasers that their property may be subject to coastal erosion, as well as local, state, and federal regulations specific to coastal properties. In 2011, the Community Planning Act was signed into law, which includes the optional designation by cities of adaptation action areas. So this legislation authorizes but does not require cities to designate adaptation action areas, which are areas at risk of flooding due to the impacts of sea level rise, and prioritized funding is given for areas designated as adaptation action areas, which is kind of the incentive to do so. And this is just an example from Pinellas County, where they have included adaptation action areas. They've designated them and included that in their comprehensive plan. In 2015, the Peril of Flood Act, which I mentioned before, became law. This requires local government comprehensive plans to include a component addressing flood risk that's caused by sea level rise. It requires both development and redevelopment principles that address reducing flood risk in coastal areas. In the next year, in 2016, the Assessment of Water Resources and Conservation Lands law was created. It was amended in 2021 to require the Florida Office of Economic and Demographic Research to include in its annual assessment of Florida's water resources and conservation lands an analysis of what future expenditures will be required by local governments to minimize the adverse economic effects of coastal flooding. In 2020, The public financing of construction projects within the coastal building zone, sometimes referred to as the SLIP law, was passed. This statute requires state-financed construction of coastal structures to undergo a sea level impact projection, which is where the SLIP comes from, requires a SLIP study to be undertaken before construction may begin. This study must include consideration of potential local sea level rise, and increased storm risk that is expected during the life of the structure. And just this past legislative session, Senate Bill 1954, statewide flooding and sea level rise resilience planning was signed into law. And this provisions include many things, but it requires the Florida Department of Environmental Protection to develop a statewide flood vulnerability and sea level rise data set, as well as an annual statewide flooding and sea level rise resilience plan. And so all of this legislation is important because it's really led the way for more widespread inclusion of sea level rise and climate change into comprehensive plans, and are all important reasons why the Sanibel Plan should also include this language. We also looked at case law from Florida, and currently there is no case law that explicitly addresses climate change induced sea level rise as we are discussing it today, which is likely to change. It likely will increase with all of this legislation that's been passed recently. There are, of course, many cases involving erosion and flooding, but that again don't specifically use the term sea level rise or climate-induced sea level rise. Just as an example of a case that does discuss erosion and flooding, there's a case from 2011, Jordan versus St. Johns County, where the court held that the local government was required to minimally maintain public roads subject to repetitive coastal flooding. So I mentioned what our task was before, but just to kind of refresh and explain a little bit more in depth. In its current, we were asked to create revisions and amendments to the Sanibel Plan so that it does specifically address sea level rise and climate change. In its current state, it does not use the term sea level rise or climate change. And it's important that it does because the city of Sanibel is and will continue to be impacted by the effects of climate change and sea level rise. And for the purposes of this project and this presentation, we did focus specifically on climate-induced sea level rise specifically. And so our process, which you've kind of already seen a little bit, how we went about completing this project, was by examining Florida laws that have been passed related to sea level rise to kind of see what direction the state's been heading and its kind of consideration of sea level rise. And then we reviewed comprehensive plans from across the state from different cities and counties to kind of see what other cities have been doing where they have successfully implemented sea level rise and climate change into their comprehensive plans as kind of best policy practice kind of models that we could base our amendments and revisions on. And then we looked closely at the Sanibel Plan to determine where we thought language could be added, kind of inserted, and where entirely new goals, objectives, and policies should be included within the plan. So we have some suggested goals and objectives and policies that we would like to share that address sea level rise and focusing on the coastal management element and specifically on natural resources, the built environment, and then bringing the Sanibel Plan in compliance with the Peril of Flood Statute. And so I will turn it over to Professor Ankerson to go through the GOPs related to the natural resources and the built environment.
So I'm just going to let it all pop up there. Just to let you know that I've done a lot of work in this comprehensive planning space. That 2007 Punta Gorda, when we inserted the words sea level rise into that that particular comprehensive plan, sort of was, as far as we can tell, the first. There's no really any real way to know that, but it resulted in a significant amount of attention being placed upon Punta Gorda in terms of getting funding from EPA and elsewhere to develop an adaptation plan and so forth. So it was just inserting a few words in a comp plan made a difference, I guess, is the point in terms of the policy trajectory of that town. The Sanibel Plan is unique. It's a very interesting document. It's unlike any other plan that I've ever looked at. The narrative is flowing in places. It's a story. It tells the story of a sanctuary, an island sanctuary and so forth. And so you could easily overwhelm it by, turning it into a more traditional comprehensive plan. And I kind of would be reluctant to do that if I were you. But again, there are these mandates from the state to start doing certain things in certain ways, and that's the way the policy framework for comprehensive planning is. So we've used that as the basis for it. We have two goals: one addressing the natural resources of the island, and the other addressing the built environment. And goals are the basis for this planning process that drives you down toward the policies that are ultimately implementable. Oh, sorry, Brian. That are ultimately implementable, and often those policies, at that policy level, it drives you down to land development regulations and things that are much more specific. So we won't be getting to that level, but we will go through goals, objectives, and policies in each of these instances. I can't see either. Okay, here's our first objective. And one of the interesting things about the Sanibel Plan is this basis underlying the entire plan, which is ecological zoning. And that is unique. I'm pretty confident of that around the state. No state has taken that and used that as the basis for all its planning. The only analogy I can see is a place I've worked a long time in Costa Rica, where they put sustainable development at the very center of all of their policy development as a nation. So maybe Sanibel and Costa Rica ought to have a friends of relationship here. So the first objective is to use an adaptation framework that is responsive to this ecological zoning framework. And to do that, you would review the map that you have. I'm not going to read all of these. I'm just going to sort of flag them for you because of time, and it's a lot of words. So yeah, so you have this this ecological zoning framework, and I think using that as a sort of basis for thinking about sea level rise is one sort of planning concept to move forward. Looking at the map, seeing how that map might change as a result of sea level rise on a periodic basis, and then identifying priority areas for adaptation to sea level rise. Priority areas could be called adaptation action areas, and there's a provision in the statute that allows you to do that. But in some ways, this is an island, and all islands, the whole island is an adaptation action area. So I'm not sure that gets you much, other than it does focus your planners and so forth on particular areas that may be especially vulnerable. So there's a number of communities have adopted these adaptation action areas. Again, sea level is going to come up, and as it comes up, the vegetation is going to change. If it can't change, you get a phenomenon called coastal squeeze, which I'll get to in a moment, and you will lose habitat as a result of that. Prioritizing the species that are most vulnerable to sea level rise is one natural resource objective that should be front and center. An example I'll give you, and I don't know that they are here. Does anyone know our Diamondback Terrapins on Sanibel? Yes. So this is a classic species. It nests on these ephemeral beaches, these little scalloped beaches that are probably most susceptible to sea level rise. The little islands in our Big Bend, those islands are going under at some level. So unless you maintain that habitat, you will lose that species. They need that little scalloped small beach that is probably one of the most threatened habitats as a result of sea level rise. And this is that coastal squeeze idea, that if you have buildings and you have the estuary and you have sea level rise, that estuary is going to run out of places to go, and so will the species and habitats that occupy it. So looking now as to where that estuary can move onto the island would be an important consideration. That's the term we use, is coastal squeeze. We use that for public access for people too, by the way. They lose beach too as the sea level rises. So identifying those places where you have room for the shoreline to migrate and prioritizing the actions that would maintain that, that pathway is a significant aspect. Living shorelines, you've probably heard a lot about living shorelines and what they are and how they operate, nature-based solution. It might be worth thinking proactively about these. We think about living shorelines on eroding shorelines, that where you can see the erosion and you want to build it back by getting sediment to accrete and so forth. You might want to be considering where should we put living shorelines so they fully mature before that sea level rise starts to take away that habitat and get that accretion, that sediment and so forth moving in. It's a sort of a different way of thinking about it than just protecting property that's already eroding. And we'll have some more discussion about that later in the afternoon, by the way. And then setbacks. Everyone knows about building setbacks and how they operate and so forth. There's a concept called rolling setbacks, where as the sea encroaches, the setback moves with it for as long as that's possible. At some point, unless you have those pathways, that will no longer be possible unless you're doing things proactively on the living shoreline stage. And Hawaii has been doing this with their setbacks on the coastline, whereas as certain erosion points happen, the setback moves back and you can no longer build that close to the water. You move where the new setback is. Conservation easements, we'll talk more about that this afternoon too, in the riparian zone is an opportunity too. And there's different ways. Not every conservation easement is protecting a large tract of land. It can protect a piece and an ecosystem value of a property as well as the property itself. And we'll talk about that in the context of mangroves a bit later, so I won't belabor it right now. So we'll move to the built environment. There's a lot more that can be done with that. We're sort of a conservation group, so we kind of keep our focus on the natural environment. But the Broward County, again, has an entire element, which is one of the central aspects of a comp plan. You have a future land use element. You have a capital improvements element. You have a coastal element. Broward now has a climate change element. And we'll talk more about Broward in a minute. So here you're just trying to make sure that the built environment, particularly the assets that the city itself is responsible for, is adaptable to sea level rise and where the priorities are going to be for adaptation, particularly in certain aspects of it. The first objective would be to look at your public infrastructure and the services that you provide and make sure that they are robust and ready for a rising sea. And it's not just the rising sea, it's the tides on top of the rising sea, what we call king tides, the nuisance flooding, and then on top of that, the storm surge that results from the increased storminess that we expect. So this is the term, there's a term called critical infrastructure. That's a FEMA-based term. Inventorying that, you probably already do, probably through some requirements through your CRS, community rating status. But there's a new term in our statutes as a result of this new legislation, Senate Bill 1954, which identifies critical assets. Those assets are much broader than critical infrastructure, and they include natural resource assets, and they require local governments as a result of this new statute, if they want to get the money that's coming in from the state. What do I have?
You're at about 20 now.
Okay, so we're a little bit too late. But anyway, we'll keep going.
You get time off for the time you were working on it.
Okay, thank you, sir. Well, I have to turn it back to Katie. I don't want to compromise her time either. But I'm almost done. So anyhow, it's important to know that there is this new statute, which is, it's not directing local governments to do things in one sense of the term, but if they don't do it, they're not going to get the funding, and there's a lot of money coming in down the pipeline to do this adaptation. So getting the comprehensive plan in line with what the state is asking, and in some cases requiring local governments to do would make sense. And this broader term of assets means you may have to look more broadly at what you have and how you inventory it. And then the parks and open space, these can be multiple use now. You have to consider the fact that maybe they can serve multiple purposes, including flood protection. Water access, these are floating docks and that sort of thing. People are doing them anyway because of tides and so forth, but making sure that you include consideration of water access and how people get to the water as the sea level rises. Boat ramps, I'm not sure there's a whole lot of boat ramps here, but there's probably a few. Those also will be affected in terms of how the parking in particular goes. And then the developed shorelines, discouraging hardened shorelines, which you already do, makes sense, but in some cases you're going to have to start thinking about them and where to put them and how to best deploy them to minimize their impact. So creating design criteria for your shorelines and your shoreline stabilization that addresses that in the context of sea level rise. I know you already have design criteria in there, but looking at it more differently. Leveling up is a term that is sort of developed, grown up just recently in the policy arena. You have to understand that the seawalls that you have were built 50 years ago in some cases, or 30 years ago. They weren't built with sea level rise in mind, and sea level rise is accelerating, so those walls will not hold back the sea as it moves up. And so you have to start thinking about raising seawalls, how to do that, and that's something that Broward County has done very effectively, I guess, in terms of a policy framework, and establishing a uniform elevation for all seawalls, because if one seawall is lower than the other, then there will be flooding over the seawall that's lower that could flood into the neighbor's property and cause flooding. So this is an important thing to begin thinking about. Again, the comprehensive plan is about directing policy. The thinking about it goes in the land development regulations. I know you're working on a sea level rise, on a seawall ordinance. And so now I'm done with that. So Katie, take over.
We just have a few more slides. I mentioned the peril of flood statute earlier, which just, again, requires local governments to include within their coastal management element of comprehensive plans this language, basically just a component addressing flood risk caused by sea level rise. The SB 1954, which I mentioned earlier and Professor Ankerson mentioned as well, it ties access to state funding to being in compliance with the peril of flood statute. So it's important that the Sanibel Plan is in compliance with that. And so, like we did for the built environment and natural resources goals, objectives, policies, we looked across the state at other cities and counties that are in compliance with the peril of flood statute as best policy practices for how we can bring the Sanibel Plan into compliance. And yes, so this language that's included in the quotes is really what's important to be basically inserted into the plan in some capacity. And so the first thing we did was we looked at the existing language of the Sanibel Plan, which I've put the site where this language currently exists. The red underlined part is the part that we suggest adding, that includes the language from the peril of flood statute. I won't read the whole thing for purposes of time, but essentially you can see it's just simple language that includes impacts of sea level rise. And the development and redevelopment component language was already existing. That's why I just bolded it so that it kind of stuck out a bit more. So there were a couple places we found where this is, again, very simple, but based on, after looking at what other counties and cities have done, it really can be just as simple as including the term sea level rise into these redevelopment and development components. So here, this, again, existing language already in the Sanibel Plan, just adding the term sea level rise. And then I believe, yes, one more place where language can be inserted into language that already exists in the plan. This, again, adopted from a different county that we know is in compliance with parallel flood statute. And then we've also, this goal, objective, and policy would be a completely new addition to the plan. This is from Clearwater, which includes the pretty much exact language from the parallel flood statute. So if Sanibel Plan, instead of just inserting language into the parts that already exist, if we wanted to add a completely new goal and objective and policy for the parallel flood statute compliance, this is what a suggestion that we have to do that. And I think that's it. So thank you very much. And yeah, if you have any questions, thank you again. This has been a very fun project.
So questions? We'll just take a few and keep moving on.
I had a question because of the government approach in Florida 10 or 15 years ago where you couldn't even use the term sea level rise. Is there any possibility in the future, I know perhaps hard to predict, is there any possibility in the future that those words will be taken out again by the governor?
Well, I mean, I don't see that as being a viable possibility. Just considering how, considering the legislation that was just passed in the past legislative session, SB 1954, I mean, it creates an entire resiliency element of basically the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. I don't foresee, based on there, because we pulled the most prominent legislation that discusses sea level rise. So I don't see that going completely backwards. I mean, that would require.
I would agree with that. And in fact, sea level rise actually kind of is less of a lightning rod than the term climate change. And there was a lot of space to use that term even when you weren't using climate change. But basically, the policy is catching up with the science is what's happening. And I think that's not going to change going forward. I mean, how we implement things may go back and forth based upon the political dynamics. But I think we're going to be dealing with sea level rise. And that's obvious from even the current administration is very focused on a lot of money coming down the pipeline to do that, and a lot of things that the cities have to do to get that money, which is one thing I was going to mention. The parallel flood statute, in order to be eligible for the vulnerability assessment funding, which makes you then eligible for the larger chunks of money to do projects, you'll have to have that parallel flood language in your comprehensive plan. So. Yeah.
All right, any other questions?
Bert Harris, do you see any takings issues with adopting of this language and affecting people's rights to build back, or how they're going to build back?
Law student?
That's a yes.
I think it depends.
That's the classic law school.
I think Professor Ankerson might be more equipped. I'm sorry to answer that question.
The answer is, it depends. So a lot of this policy language is simply that until you implement it. And once you implement it, there could be issues associated with takings, but a lot of this is played out already elsewhere in the country. So it depends on how aggressive you are and whether you are actually regulating versus taking and the nature of that regulation. So it's a tough question to answer in the abstract, I guess I would say, but I don't see the policies that we've provided here as presenting any of those issues at this point.
One more question.
This is just a very quick comment so that the people in the audience understand that within this next year, the city of Sanibel, through the evaluation and appraisal review process, will be having to address peril of flood. And thank you, you've made my job a lot easier with all the work you've done.
Thank you, Christine.
And that was our intent. Yeah, and there's a lot more that can be done, but again, you can overwhelm this plan. I mean, it's this tricky balance between making it look like a big, fat, bureaucratic document and the sort of elegant narrative that it is about this town. So next, we'll have our discussion of. You don't need this mic. That's the problem. We'll have our discussion about mangrove trimming, which had a course of its own over the course of this semester as we learned a little bit more about this statute. And we know it's a sensitive issue from talking to people around the state about it. So you'll hear a little bit about that by Emery. Take it away.
All right, good morning. Thank you everyone for coming. We appreciate you tuning in to our presentation. My name is Emery Wellman, and I'm a PhD student in the Fisheries and Aquatic Sciences program at University of Florida.
My name is Emily Burwell. I'm a third-year law student at the University of Florida.
Yeah, and I'm Calvin Kam, a first-year PhD student at School of Natural Resource and Environment at University of Florida.
So today, sorry, we're going to be doing a little do-si-do here as we fight for microphone space, so that's the added aspect. So we will be talking today about the Mangrove Trimming and Preservation Act, which is the main act that governs mangrove trimming in Florida, and some revelations that we had over the course of the semester about how the ecology of these mangroves and the policy intersect and at points even conflict. So in terms of a quick outline, we'll just describe mangroves, which you're all very familiar with, how they intersect with the concept of riparian rights, the MTPA itself, and then Sanibel's trimming ordinance, which stems from the act. Then we'll go over some issues that we found with the framework as it currently stands. Calvin and I will present the results of a modeling wave attenuation by mangrove roots, and then we'll close with some potential policy solutions.
Yeah, so since we're talking about mangrove today, so we know that mangrove provide multiple ecosystem services. We know it's providing nursery and shelter for fish. We know it's doing the blue carbon stocking. But for today's topic, we basically focus on the natural-based wave protection, which is a critical component of a living shoreline. So there are three major species, mangrove species in Florida, but here in Sanibel, it's mostly like red mangroves, which has these complex and strong crop roots shown in the picture in front of the homeowner's riparian fringe. So it can naturally grow about 30 to 50 feet tall for southwest Florida, and it's tall enough to block a lot of homeowners' view, which is part of the key points of the riparian rights.
Okay, so I wanted to start with the concept of.
We're being very distracted.
Okay, what's happening? The concept of riparian rights in Florida, just because that's kind of how the mangrove trimming is treated, with how the law kind of stems from. So riparian rights are a right that attaches to a waterfront property solely because it is adjacent to a body of water. And it's pretty interesting because it attaches even though the landowner doesn't actually own the land that the water is covering. And it attaches to the property and is separated short of an express agreement. So when you sell the property, they kind of attach with it. And riparian rights by statute include rights of ingress, egress, boating, bathing, and fishing, which is pretty much just the rights you would probably hope to have if you're next to a body of water. So with the ability to build a dock, to swim, to use your boat, just things like that. But Florida is somewhat unique in the fact that it recognizes the riparian right to an unobstructed view, which is pretty nice just because that can add a lot of value to a waterfront property. But then that kind of comes into play with mangrove trimming because mangroves, as Calvin said, can grow pretty tall. And if you're not allowed to trim them, they could grow up to block your unobstructed view. So that brings us to the state statute, which is the 1996 Mangrove Trimming and Preservation Act. And like I said, because of the riparian right to an unobstructed view, the Florida legislature had to think about homeowners' right to a view, but also the benefits mangroves can provide and kind of find the balancing act that does both. So first, I wanted to start by showing the definition of trim in the statute, which is to cut mangrove branches, twigs, limbs, and foliage, but not to remove, defoliate, or destroy the mangroves. But notably for what we are going to go into later, it does not include roots in either way, so it's kind of confusing. And then also, the MTPA allows certain trimming in riparian mangrove fringes without any kind of prior approval or permitting. So what is a riparian mangrove fringe? The statute defines it as mangroves growing along shoreline of private property, property owned by a government entity, or sovereign submerged land, but it doesn't include mangroves on uninhabited islands or lands set aside for conservation. And so it's a depth that does not exceed 50 feet. So if you look at my very lovely drawing, you can see, so it's measured perpendicular to the shore from the waterward trunk of, or the most landward mangrove to the waterward tree, so pretty much back. So if that area is greater than 50 feet, it's not considered a riparian mangrove fringe. But if it's less, then it is for the statute's purposes. Okay, so the activity that does not require prior approval under the state statute. So I think this tree diagram is pretty helpful for demonstrating what all of this text says. But homeowners can trim without getting any kind of permit if it's below 10 feet before you trim, and you can't trim it below 6 feet total. And then another interesting rule is that if your shoreline is greater than 150 feet, you can't trim more than 65% of the mangroves. But then if you have mangroves that have a pre-trimmed height higher than 10 feet, you can still have a professional mangrove trimmer come in and do the trimming without extra permitting. And professional mangrove trimmers include arborists, professional wetland scientists, and certified ecologists, some of the things that listed in the statute. And so if the mangrove is less than 24 feet, these professional mangrove trimmers can come in and trim more than 6 feet. But then there's an extra rule that if it's greater than 16 feet, you have to do it in stages so that you don't do less than 25% at a time. And then there's also an interesting grandfathered exemption. So before this 1996 act, if the homeowner was allowed to trim to lower than this, such as 4 feet, they can still do that after this act was passed. Okay, and so the state statute allows for delegation to local governments. So local governments can write in and show that they have the resources necessary to have an adequate mangrove trimming system. And if they do that, then they can get that authority. And in that case, they have all of the authority to issue permits. Like, it's all in their hands and not in the Department of Environmental Protection anymore. But there are some limitations to this delegation. And one of the most striking things is that they may not restrict or qualify the exemptions to trim mangroves and riparian mangrove fringe areas in any way. But they are allowed to have stricter regulations outside of riparian mangrove fringe. And right now in Florida, there's only 7 local governments that have this authority, and the city of Sanibel is one of them. So Sanibel has its own trimming ordinance, and as it makes sense, most of the exemptions are almost identical. The only difference is that there's more strict notice requirements for professional mangrove trimmers, which is specifically allowed under the state statute. But they do have, Sanibel does have stricter permitting requirements for outside of riparian mangrove fringe. And some of the ones that I thought were most interesting is it's authorized only during the months of October through January. There's no trimming within 30 feet of nesting birds, and it has to be monitored by a city manager or inspector. And then some of permits for mangrove alteration are only allowed for these 4 reasons, so reasonable access to the water, safety, things like that.
Okay, so our project took 2 main prongs. Our first avenue was doing our own research, which Emily has just summarized, kind of going into the act, going into the literature we could find. But a really critical aspect of this work, given that we are coming at this very complex issue as outsiders was involving people who deal with this trimming and these regulations on the ground. So as such, we took several meetings with Florida Sea Grant agents and a local arborist who actively trims mangroves in Northeast Florida. And as a quick refresher, Florida Sea Grant is a partnership between the Florida Board of Education, NOAA, and Florida's citizens and governments. And its goal is to conduct extension, outreach, and education along with Florida's counties. So as such, they have agents stationed around the state in the coastal areas who deal with ecological issues like this. So after these meetings with them, one of the main things that we took away was that these sea grant agents have a concern with the way that mangroves are actually sort of mischaracterized in this act. More specifically, they are often treated as bushes rather than trees, which, as Calvin described earlier, these can grow to be massive, massive plants. So calling them a tree, calling them a bush, for example, by using the term horticultural versus arboricultural, is really kind of mischaracterizing their ecology and their life history, in addition to ignoring a huge aspect of their structure, which are the roots, which, as Emily said, are not currently included in the definition of trim at all. Additionally, some of those professional mangrove trimming certifications that Emily listed really aren't that relevant to mangroves at all. For example, you can be a certified ecologist and have absolutely no background in mangroves, yet under this law, you are technically able to go out and trim mangroves. So the sea grant agents had some concern with that as well, that these certifications don't guarantee that you have a knowledge of sustainable mangrove growth. And then Calvin and I also undertook a literature review of existing scientific studies which go into the impacts of trimming. And unfortunately, our main conclusion was there's not much information, which we were pretty surprised by. A few studies have looked at fish communities between trimmed and untrimmed mangroves, and also the amount of litter fall, so the amount of leaves that are hitting the substrate. And not surprisingly, trimmed mangroves produce fewer leaves, which is an important part of the mangrove-based food web. And they also, not surprisingly, have reduced canopy sizes after trimming. But really, there's not much to go on. And then finally, another recurring issue that these sea grant agents brought up was enforcement. That these issues with the language of the statute notwithstanding, it's just really hard to enforce on the ground. And one of the people we spoke with said that at one point in her career, she was responsible for enforcement on 1,700 parcels of land as one person. So the statistic she gave us was that 20% of complaints about improper mangrove trimming result in enforcement. So that means there are potentially hundreds of cases of people improperly trimming mangroves that these poor government employees just can't get to. So that then informed Calvin's and my approach to our ecological model. So obviously mangroves provide tons of ecosystem services, but based on the dearth of knowledge about wave attenuation and the ways in which it might be affected by improper trimming, we decided to ask the following question. So how does the configuration of the mangrove fringe affect its provision of wave attenuation benefits? And wave attenuation is the change in wave height over time, kind of as it passes through a coastal habitat, and as such is a proxy for coastal protection, which is a really important service to consider when we think about sea level rise and everything Katie just discussed. So in terms of our scenarios, we wanted to look at trimmed, untrimmed, natural mangroves, and then mangroves with a living shoreline element. And living shorelines often involve components like oysters, which can serve as an additional wave break and kind of an ecologically sustainable way to protect your shoreline. But interestingly, another thing we learned in our conversations with the sea grant agents is that people, especially at the northern extent of mangrove ranges, are actively choosing to not install living shorelines because they're afraid that their living shoreline structure might trap mangroves and actually facilitate their establishment. So that was another really interesting dynamic that we didn't expect to learn when we think about mangrove ecology and how homeowners view them. So we also added a living shoreline element, and we chose to conduct this model on a residential scale. There are very complex, impressive modeling efforts that have modeled wave attenuation through entire mangrove forests, often in Southeast Asia, and often in response to big storm events. So the Indian Ocean tsunami, there are some models in southern Florida with hurricanes. But given that we were thinking about a Sanibel homeowner, we wanted to do it on a smaller scale with more kind of chronic, typical wave conditions. And now Calvin will walk you through, oh wait, no, I'm sorry, me for one more second. And these are scenarios, the 4-foot mangrove, which is over-trimmed and both with and without oysters, a 6-foot mangrove, which is compliant, as Emily described, with and without oysters, and a 10-foot mangrove, which is kind of one that the homeowner has just let do its thing and let it grow as tall as it wants. Now, Calvin.
Thank you, Emery. So yeah, like resonate back to the questions that Emery brought about. We kind of decompose these questions into 3 main hypotheses relating to mangrove height, which is affected by the trimming, and oyster reef, which is a critical component of living shoreline, and finally the fringe width, which is how wide the fringe attenuate wave. So don't worry, we'll dive deep into how scientific models prove or disprove this kind of hypothesis. So first, to just lay the scientific foundation of our modeling results, we're basically using the vegetation model for red mangrove to model the trimming effect, and using a hydrodynamic model to model how roots is attenuated wave. So some of the critical parameters here shown on the right side, but what's the really key one was that the K, which is called the decay efficient, and is differed in different scenarios that we'll show here. So basically what we do is we pull in the hydrodynamic parameters in Sanibel, which is supported by various resources here. And we posted our 3 scenarios being like first near emergent A and B emergent and C sub-emergent cases for 6, 10, and 4 feet of mangrove respectively. And these are having the different decay coefficient of K, and is having different results, as we'll see later on. So just to give you an intuitive sense of how this wave is attenuated, here's a line showing that how wave energy is decaying across this distance of mangrove fringe. As we can see here down on the figure, that is a normal kind of Dinkins-Bayou homeowners with mangrove fringe. So we can see here the first conclusion being even 4 feet of mangrove is doing amazing job here attenuating the wave. You see, as you can see in the green lines across the distance. And there's also this difference being like adding oyster reef as the components of living shoreline, further boosting this efficiency of wave attenuation. So comparing 4 feet with 6 feet, as the blue lines show here, 6 feet is doing the better job, even the best actually, if we compare with 10, because the reason we'll dive into later, but the 6 feet is really doing the best job here. So why is that, and how our numbers prove or disprove our hypothesis? So for our first hypothesis, we first hypothesized that wave attenuation would increase with, positively with the mangrove height, but it's actually not, which is partially true, because 10 feet is not doing as good as 6 feet, because the proportion that the roots and it emerge under the water that is providing that drag force to really attenuate the wave is less in 10 feet. Actually, in 6 feet in Sanibel, it's doing the most critical job because of the most of the roots being submerged into the water and doing the attenuated job here. So this being like the near emergent 6 feet being the best scenarios in our modeling, and it is proved by our numbers, which makes 6 feet have higher wave attenuation percentage, about 1 to 7% here. So for the second component, the oyster reef being the part of the living shoreline, it is actually doing great for even boosting the wave attenuation efficiency. Like you can see here on the numbers, that with all the oyster reef in all kinds of scenarios, adding oyster reef is taking like up to 1 to 3% of the efficiency here. Another thing about the oyster reef is that it's encouraging the natural recruitment of mangrove seedlings, which we really brings to the third, last but not least, hypothesis that wider fringes are really providing more of the wave energy attenuation. So as we can see here with these columns, so the darker color means the wider the fringe. As we can see in all kinds of scenarios, the arrows always go left, meaning that wider fringe always providing more, significantly more wave attenuation. Notice also that 7 meters of mangrove fringe can really do the amazing job like reducing wave energy by almost 100% with just the 7 meters of fringe roots. And unfortunately, it's really not the case exactly happening here in Sanibel. Most homeowners in Sanibel have about 0 to 5 meters of mangrove fringe, maybe even less because we're estimating using arrow images down. And so it really highlights the importance of introducing living shoreline and wider the fringe with oyster reef. So it also resonates back to what Tom said about living shoreline and being placed in here as providing the function of attenuate wave. And this is even becoming more important in this context of sea level rise and climate change. So.
Okay, so given our model, our big takeaways were, not surprisingly, roots are the really critical aspect of mangroves that cause this wave attenuation and can protect coastal properties. The fringe width really does matter, so if we can preserve a wider fringe, a wider shore perpendicular fringe, that's going to mean more benefits. As we saw those curves falling over time, that means the deeper it goes into the fringe, the more wave attenuation you have. And Tom brought up the concept of leveling up and kind of adjacent flooding between properties. And that's a big caveat of this model, is we are modeling attenuation here. We're not making any sort of statement about where the water is going afterwards, but the fact that it's being slowed down to such a degree by the mangroves is still really critical. And then finally, as Calvin said, oysters can be an insurance policy in that they can kind of bolster the effective wave attenuation if you have a really narrow fringe, and can potentially help recruit them. And for some reason, if a fringe is over-trimmed or degraded in some way, oysters can potentially pick up some of the slack. So putting all of this together, where do we go from here? We thought of a couple of potential policy solutions. First, really based off of the things that sea grant agents came to us with their concerns. We think the definition of trim should be amended to include roots, given that they're such an important part of mangrove ecology and function. They really need to be called out specifically. And also potentially consider changing the PMT certification requirements so that people like arborists and landscape architects, which are really relevant professions, are kind of highlighted as the people who will be most likely to trim a mangrove sustainably. Oh my gosh, and these are all number 1, which is helpful. Sorry about that. But they're all equally important. That's why. Second, FEMA administers the community rating system, which essentially will give communities a reduction in their flood insurance premiums based on their use of living shorelines and other kind of sustainable, ecologically friendly solutions. And we thought, okay, well, that happens at the community scale. Is there any possibility that an individual homeowner could be given a deduction based on the fact that they maintain an intact fringe or they add an oyster breakwater? We're not really sure how feasible that is, but that was just something we brainstormed. And then finally, the last thing that we're really excited about is looping back to the beginning, the concept of conservation easements and how they interact with Florida's riparian rights.
All right, so like Tom brought up in the last presentation, we're looking at kind of the idea of conservation easements and potentially utilizing them, because even though the attenuation thing said 6 feet was fine, that's not all of the benefits that mangroves provide, so there could be reason to want to encourage taller mangroves. So a conservation easement is a voluntary agreement between a landowner and a qualified organization that restricts use and development of land to protect its conservation values. So in this case, the idea would be the landowner could give up their riparian right to an unobstructed view and protect the ecological values of mangroves. But then there are some important considerations that homeowners could be reluctant to want to give up their right to an unobstructed view. For one thing, views increase the value of property significantly. In some cases, it can so much as double the value of property, so a homeowner may not want to give that up. Also, easements run with the land, which means that they're perpetual. So when you sell your property or anything like that. It's going to keep attaching to the property, so you can't just give up that easily. And then, so there can be some incentives with tax benefits. There's a property tax exemption that sometimes applies if you have a conservation easement, but it doesn't always apply to smaller parcels of land. So it's not, there's a whole analysis there that's beyond the scope of this presentation, but it's not guaranteed that the homeowner would be able to benefit from that. But even with these considerations, there are a lot of benefits that homeowners may want to consider, and one of those things are the tax benefits. The property tax exemption could apply, but there's also other exemptions like the charitable income tax deduction and other federal income tax benefits. And then also just the idea of the benefits that mangroves could provide to that homeowner's property. So I guess the idea that we're kind of considering here is that the Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation could potentially use conservation easements from willing homeowners to protect mangroves. And in my research, I didn't really find anything that said, like, straight up that this wouldn't work, that they couldn't do this. So I feel like that's usually kind of a good sign. And one of the most relevant cases that I found was a Florida Supreme Court case, and the important language I included on here, but they said that riparian rights can be separated from a land or with a bilateral agreement, and most importantly, all or any interest in riparian rights may be transferred by voluntary act of the upland owner. So reading that, it seems like the riparian right to an unobstructed view could be transferred by a voluntary act, which kind of lines up with this idea of a conservation easement. So it seems like an interesting idea that could be looked into. And that is our presentation. So thank you, and let us know if you have questions.
Question? Yeah.
So I know you focused on wave attenuation, but did you consider the benefits of wind mitigation when you look at taller mangroves at all?
So in an ideal world, we would have wanted to. And the big caveat here is Calvin and I are ecologists. We are not engineers. So this was about what we could wrap our heads around. If we had more time, we would have wanted to do wind as well, because from the literature review we did, the wind attenuation is clearly a really important part. And we honestly had hopes. Dr. Yu is an engineer at UF who helped us out with this model, and he told us to some degree that wind models and wave models are somewhat transferable, but they are different enough in that the wind model, the main agent of force reduction is the foliage as opposed to the roots. And we wanted to really stay closer to the water and go with the roots here. Absolutely, though, if we were to expand the model, it would be to include wind as well.
Okay, thank you. And I just want to point out from a habitat standpoint, when mangroves are trimmed down to 6 or 10 feet even, we lose that important habitat for roosting and nesting of our shorebirds. And so I just think we really need to be careful that in your recommendations that we're not recommending from a wave attenuation standpoint that we want to encourage or give incentives to homeowners to remove the canopy and reduce the height of mangroves that would dramatically impact nesting bird habitat, which is what we really care about here on the islands. It's wildlife and wildlife habitat. So I think that's important as you're making recommendations to the city or other local governments that we think about that as well. So thank you.
Oh,
Great
yeah,
work.
absolutely. And we should have emphasized that better at the beginning, but clearly choosing one ecosystem service from mangroves is futile because they provide so many. So yeah, we really honed in on that one, but absolutely, yeah, the nectin habitat as well is a really important part. And we also clearly, and the Sea Grant agent spoke about this as well, that the litter fall is the main engine of kind of the production of the habitat completely, everything that is below it, including birds as well. And so that was one of the things that they also noted of don't forget about the sheer impact of losing that litter fall, because that's an incredibly important subsidy for everything that depends on the mangroves. So yeah, we should have definitely said that more explicitly, that we're not, this is one ecosystem service of dozens. So no,
Great work.
absolutely, thank you.
Yeah, Brian Korn. I was interested in the mangrove propagation. It seems like Fringe is, critical. So is there any impact on trimming versus mangrove propagation? Do taller trees propagate faster than short trimmed ones or vice versa? I'm not, you know, full bottle on mangrove propagation.
So that depends. So that's one thing that Emily sort of hinted at. That depends when you trim. The main reason that people restrict trimming to those certain months is because if you can trim when a mangrove is not actively trying to reproduce, then it is far less stressful for the mangrove and it's more likely to recover. So that's one aspect to consider, is you can really, by trimming, you can essentially dictate its reproductive cycle, for better or for worse. And the arborist with whom we spoke said that if you trim incorrectly, you can absolutely essentially doom a mangrove to stunted and low productivity for the rest of its life. He said, this was incredible, he said he could walk up to a mangrove and as an arborist tell if someone had done a hack job on it. Because yeah, it reproduces differently, they produce kind of stress growth at wonky angles that is weaker than the rest of the tree. And he said that he can absolutely look at a mangrove and tell that someone didn't do it right. And he wasn't surprised by that because often the people who are allowed to be professional mangrove trimmers, they want to go out with a chainsaw and kind of do what they usually do when you just cut the top off of a shrub. And he said he goes out with like one tiny pair of hedge trimmers, and that it takes hours that you have to examine how the branches are transitioning and to make sure you essentially redirect the growth in a sustainable way, including with reproduction. So absolutely, if it's trimmed incorrectly, you can doom a mangrove to propagate poorly.
Okay, some of the trimming is not top down, but it's through the trees, so you can have a view through the mangrove without altering the height. So how does that way of attenuation when you have that sort of trimming?
That was a great question. Yeah, I don't know if we got this windowing kind of trimming images here in our slides, but yeah, we come across some of the scenarios. This is probably the first image you're showing that there's a kind of window trim here. So yeah, that was really has something to do with like the trimming of the roots. So like Emery have said, so there's not like clearly defined trimming definition of roots. So they did not say that you can or cannot trim the root. But what we're really trying to hope to reform this this statute is that we're trying to be clear about do not trim the root, because root is really doing the good job of attenuate the wave here. And if you trim like you said, this windowing kind of stuff, you definitely have to trim the root downstairs, and you're probably doing some kind of even deck boat docks or some kind of stuff with that. So that is really where we're trying to prohibit here. But as long as to trim the foliage, it is allowed for the figures here, that if you trim, for example, below the up to like 65%, then you can trim the foliage the way you want, like perpendicularly to the ground. So yes, as long as you trim the foliage and not trimming the roots, I guess for our purpose here, it is allowed and should not be reformed. But really, we're trying to emphasize here is that do not trim the root for your own property protection.
I think we'll let it go for now, but just just for my friends from SCCF, this idea if you could find a willing homeowner who is willing to give up that right to an unobstructed view and then draft that easement, that would probably be a precedent, a first in the state, I think, to draft a conservation easement to give up a riparian right to an unobstructed view, and it would be an interesting precedent to have in the state going forward. So that's just an interesting take home, and there's probably some law students that would love to work on that easement. I'll just put that. All right, so the next presentation, we're going to spend a little time talking about the interior canals here on Sanibel. Like most of coastal Florida and most of especially southwest Florida, residential canals are a big part of the human ecosystem, if you will, and they provide both issues in terms of water quality, but also, as you'll see, some opportunities here to improve that water quality. So I'm going to turn it over to this student team who will introduce themselves and move it forward. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Matt Kashgarian. I'm a student at the School of Environmental Engineering.
Hi everyone, I'm Sydney Williams. I'm a PhD student in the Environmental Engineering Sciences Department at University of Florida.
I'm Katie. I introduced myself earlier, and this is really Sydney and Matt's work. I have a very, very small policy part, but just so everyone knows, this is really all that.
Yeah, so to start, can you guys hear me okay? Okay. To start with what we were originally tasked with, on the engineering side, it was to simulate the hydrology and water chemistry of an idealized canal under restoration aquaculture scenarios. And we'll be unpacking this for the most part throughout the talk. On the policy side, it was to recommend goals, objectives, and policies focused on nature-based solutions to water quality impairment. So our findings and lessons learned from building the simulation have produced insight on potential next steps towards canal water quality restoration. And our project also serves as the beginning of a potential nature-based solution to canal water quality, providing an example of how the island can implement the policies we recommend. So we'll start by getting everyone oriented. This map depicts Sanibel and mostly highlights the Sanibel Slough, or some may know it as the Sanibel River. So the Sanibel Slough is divided into east and west segments with their own respective basins, and we'll mostly focus on the East Slough today, primarily because its water flows into the East End Canal, or what we've called the East End Canal, which our group decided to focus on. You can also see in green the marine and estuarine wetlands as categorized by the National Wetland Inventory. That dominate the back barrier region of Sanibel. So the quality of fresh and marine water that we consider today has an impact on the resiliency of these ecosystems, and that's important to keep in mind. So unfortunately, both the slough and Sanibel's surrounding marine waters are verified nutrient impaired by the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. This means that the long-term average of chlorophyll A, which is an indicator of algal biomass, is exceeding the acceptable levels deemed by the DEP. So the slough has been designated impaired since the 90s. Meanwhile, the surrounding marine waters of Sanibel were designated impaired just recently at the end of October. This impairment is largely attributed to the nutrient loading from upstream sources along the Caloosahatchee Basin and other basins, and from local sources on the island. But it's important to mention that the City of Sanibel, in partnership with the Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation and others, has made a tremendous effort in trying to improve their water quality conditions. And although not comprehensive, this slide shows several of those strategies. One of the island's more recent efforts is the Sanibel Clean Canal Program. And so largely due to their high residence times, canals show signs of impairment sooner and more intensely than other water bodies. This picture shows a dense algal bloom in one of Cape Coral's canals. So this is not Sanibel, but just to emphasize that canals can get pretty gross. So starting in 2019, SCCF has been collecting discrete surface water samples across the island's canals during both the wet and dry season to better understand the spatial and temporal variability in canal water quality. So the East End Canal has quite a few sampling locations in the program. These are all indicated by the yellow points on the map. We chose the East End Canal because it had the poorest water quality in the data set generally, and the canal receives intermittent freshwater discharge from the East Slough, like I mentioned before, and I've highlighted here, hopefully you can see my mouse, the Donax Wastewater Reclamation Facility and the Sanibel Island Golf Club. And I highlighted these because The East Basin has the greatest volume of reclaimed wastewater usage applied annually for irrigation on the island. And SCCF has found a continual increase in phosphorus in the East Slough despite efforts to reduce that. That's likely partially driven to this heavy use of reclaimed wastewater. Now, freshwater discharge from the slough rarely occurs in the winter because there isn't much rain, but in the summer, when there are high rain events, the Weirs Gate can be open quite often, and the connectivity between the slough and the canal system can be significant. So it's important to consider the influence this nutrient loading can have on the canal's water quality, and in turn, the water that is eventually flushed out into the San Carlos Bay here. So these are interpolated chlorophyll A values from SCCF's data set. You can see the color scale at the bottom indicates varying levels of chlorophyll A concentration in micrograms per liter. And I'll point out here that the numeric nutrient criteria for the San Carlos Bay is 3.7 micrograms per liter as the long-term average. So any areas that aren't this blue color here indicate that its chlorophyll A values are above the criteria for the bay, but it's important to keep in mind these aren't long-term averages. So across the 4 sampling periods, there's a gradient of precipitation and temperature. Total rainfall in the month preceding the sample collection is shown across the top of each panel here. And you can see that the bayside of the canal remains relatively stable across the sampling periods when compared to the back end of the canal. Although the last 2 panels show similar time points in the calendar year, the rainfall is almost doubled in the August panel, and in turn, the volume of freshwater discharge from the slough is substantially higher. So this is reflected in the difference of chlorophyll A around the freshwater discharge point, as I'm circling here. And so for example, or to get into the numbers, in July 2019, the values were between 4 to 10 micrograms per liter around the freshwater discharge point, while in August 2021, with the high rain, they were between 30 to 50 micrograms per liter, which is quite high. So how do we potentially mitigate this problem? There's a huge movement towards restoration aquaculture right now, and it has varying definitions. Sometimes it's about growing food. Sometimes it's about transplanting out what is grown to repopulate lost habitat, which is common for corals or increasingly popular for corals. But for us, in our scenario, we're referring to restoration aquaculture as either growing or transplanting filter feeding species in a nutrient impaired area to improve that area's water quality. So this could involve things like oyster gardening, where private dock owners suspend oyster cages or some other device from their docks. It can involve sponge gardening. This picture shows the sponges mounted on the bottom of a water body, but there's other approaches that involve suspending them from structures, which would be more conducive for a canal environment. It includes living seawalls, which is not a common concept in the United States. This is in Australia. But basically, this involves the walls being outfitted with material that's conducive for oyster recruitment. You can see that oysters starting to recruit this material. And finally, in the case of clams, one can simply transplant these filter feeders to the bottom of impaired water bodies. A good example of this is the Indian River Lagoon Clam Restoration Initiative. So here are the stars of our show. The average clearance rates of these filter feeders are ordered from left to right. A clearance rate is defined as the volume of water per time.
It just got a little dark, so I think we just need to, I'm not sure what went on. Oops.
Is that better?
I don't know, it just went a little dim. I'm not sure why. The next slide was better?
The last one you went back to was mine.
Oh, so that's weird, okay. We'll see these stars again, so should we just proceed?
Sure. I have a bit more to say on this slide. I'll just mention that clearance rates are defined as the volume of water cleared per time per gram of biomass of the filter feeder. Oh no.
All right, we'll get there.
Is it fading? Okay. All right. Well, there's plenty of, these pictures are repeated, so you'll get to see the nice photos in a second. But sorry, I just want to mention a few more things. On the far left, we have our southern quahog, who generally has the poorest filtration capacity. Next, we have the famous eastern oyster. And lastly, the fire sponge, which is a commonly occurring species in Florida and is known to grow in canal systems, and it has the highest filtration capacity of the species we considered. So before we get into our model, it's important to consider the species-specific environmental tolerances and how that can inform where in the canal these different species may do best. So hopefully you guys can see the photos a little bit better now, but in terms of low salinity tolerance, the filter feeders are ordered from most to least sensitive to that environmental impact. Sponges do best in high saline environments that are relatively with low variability. Clams are more tolerant to low salinities, while oysters can actually do quite well with higher freshwater input. So same idea as the maps before, but these are interpolated salinity values. During the winter, you can see in the first two panels that salinity is consistently high across the canal system. During high rain events and in turn, high freshwater discharge in the summer, the salinity regime completely changes. And because the canal is subject to such changes, oysters are likely to do best in, or likely to be the best option. Sorry, I'm trying to use the cursor here. In areas closer to the freshwater discharge point because of this change in salinity, while the environment closer to the bay may be more conducive for the more sensitive species like the sponges. Then we consider low oxygen tolerance. So again, ordered from most to least sensitive, and sponges need high flows and high dissolved oxygen to survive. In fact, sponge die-offs in the Florida Bay have often been attributed to low oxygen events. Meanwhile, oysters and clams are hardier and can survive short-term exposure to anoxic environments. However, in severely low oxygen environments, we would expect these filter feeders to essentially close up and their filtration service would be lost. So looking at interpolated dissolved oxygen values, you can see that the most interior portions of the canal across all sampling periods suffer from severe hypoxia. And this is expected because of their high residence times. Water's just simply not flowing very much in these areas. So considering the clear difference, I'm gonna focus on these last two panels. Considering the clear difference between July and August, it seems that severely low oxygen in the summer could be episodic events in many areas of the canal. And so the hardier oysters and clams could potentially persist through these short-term events. But considering both of these environmental parameters, it's clear that sponges would likely only survive, if at all, in the canal areas close to the bay. Okay, so just as a reminder, our model was to simulate the hydrology and water chemistry, and more specifically, the change in chlorophyll A of an idealized canal under restoration aquaculture scenarios. And I'll hand it off to Matt. Thank you.
All right, thanks. So we looked out to achieve this objective through this idealized canal system, and we decided to run it through two different time periods of the wet season that Sydney discussed earlier in 2019 and 2021. And this picture here is kind of like a visualization of the equation that we use to run this simulation. So we have influences of water and concentration into this ideal canal system, and also the concentration present into this canal system. Along with that is the filter feeders that we're going to look to use varying in our concentration, whether that be oysters hanging from a dock or oysters along the seawall, like Sydney showed you in these pictures, sponges hanging from dock, clams laying on the floor, which all are separated in different equations to figure out which one is best filter feeder for our canal scenario. And so now I'm going to go through the parameters that made up our equation, which is kind of shown as the influences I just showed you. So first is the concentration already in the canal system. And this was determined from those measurements that SCCF made earlier, and we use these as an initial concentration that we use as the variable C there at time step 0. So when we started our simulation, this was what we viewed as already present in this canal system. And then after that, we decided to go with our size of our idealized canal system. We decided to make it 1,000 meters long, 35 meters width, and then 3 meters deep. And from there, we decided to have our first influence of water and concentration into this, and that's from the San Carlos Bay. We decided to use historic data from USGS at McIntyre Creek that had a station there from 2010 to 2013. We used this data and then we lowered it in order of magnitude to best fit a canal system that we decided to go with in our ideal canal system. For the concentration variable that we added in here is from averaged across the years 2008 to 2021 from our months that we decided to run our simulations, what we determined as the wet season. Next is the influence from the freshwater slough, and that was determined from flow values that were given at the Beach Road weir. When the weir was open, that was our influence of water into the concentration, and then the concentration of, the water into our idealized canal. And then the concentration level was an average across 2014 to 2018 that was measured in the slough. So whatever the average was from those yearly periods was our influence every time we decided the weir was open to influence the canal system. And then after that lastly is the filtration rate that we decided to go with into our canal system. This was determined by the clearance rate that Sydney discussed earlier, multiplied by the biomass, the amount of whatever species we decided to go with in this calculation together, which would help us determine the change of chlorophyll over time. So we decided to go with different biomasses at different scenarios, and then for each species as well, which would help us determine our results. And I would also just like to list some assumptions that we made within our model or simulation. The first would be that the canal flow and water quality are homogeneous, that the canal outflow is only tidally driven from San Carlos Bay, and that the canal environment is conductive to filter feeders, and lastly, that there's no decay or growth rate of the algal community or filter feeders within our idealized canal. And I'll hand it right back to Sydney to discuss the results of this.
Yeah, so we'll start with the 2019 wet season simulation, and our results show change in chlorophyll over time. So on the y-axis here, we have chlorophyll A in micrograms per liter, and on the x-axis, we have time in months. So we ran the simulations with various orders of magnitude of biomass, as indicated by the color scale here, and I hope you can see it on the TV. The lightest color shows background levels of change that would occur without filter feeders. So because of our assumptions, the simulation without any filter feeders shows that the tide slowly flushes out the chlorophyll A contamination, and this may not be entirely representative of the canal, or of the true canal on the east end. One more general point here is that you can see the small tidal oscillations of chlorophyll A and also the large pulses of chlorophyll A. That's from the East Slough freshwater discharge. So now considering the effects of filter feeders, with the highest clearance rate among our species selected, the fire sponge begins to affect the system at just 100 grams of biomass, which is really not much, and I'll dig into that in a little bit. At the highest magnitude of biomass, the sponges keep the system at extremely low levels of chlorophyll A. The fire sponge has an average biomass of 30 grams of dry tissue weight and an average density of 9 individuals per square meter. So considering these two metrics, 100,000 grams of biomass, which is our highest magnitude, translates to about 370 square meters of a canal that would need to be populated by these sponges. That takes up about 6% of our idealized canal system. Moving on to the oysters, with a lower clearance rate capacity, they began to noticeably influence the change of chlorophyll A at about 10,000 grams of biomass. And at the highest magnitude, the difference in chlorophyll A concentrations at the end of the simulation is quite substantial. So a study in Tampa Bay estimated that the average biomass density of eastern oyster on seawalls to be 582 grams of dry tissue weight per meter squared. This translates to about 170 square meters of seawall with an established coverage of oyster. It takes up about 3% of our idealized canal. Last and arguably least, we have the effect of clams. At most magnitudes, the clams aren't able to affect change to the system different from the background levels of the tidal flushing. At the highest magnitude we tested, clams do begin to shift the system. Now, with an average size of a quahog clam being around 60 to 70 millimeters in width, this converts to about 3 grams of dry tissue weight per individual. So adding 100,000 grams of dry tissue weight to the canal is roughly equivalent to adding around 35,000 individuals. So to give that a little bit of context, the Indian River Lagoon Clam Restoration Initiative reared and transplanted 2.5 million clams to the lagoon in 2020. So 35,000 is really not that much. So because water from our idealized canal flushes out into the San Carlos Bay, it's important to contextualize this data with the bay's numeric nutrient criteria of 3.7 micrograms per liter, shown by the dashed line here that runs across the panels. At medium to high magnitudes of biomass, our filter feeders are able to push the system's conditions down or well below that criteria value. Now, looking at the 2021 wet season, which had far more rain and far more discharge from the slough, you can notice that the initial chlorophyll A values are much higher. They're around 35 micrograms per liter, as opposed to the 7 micrograms per liter in the 2019. There's also, in this scenario, only the sponges were able to allow our idealized canal to meet the criteria for the San Carlos Bay. So I think one of the takeaways here is that higher biomass of the other filter feeders would be required to potentially bring those conditions down.
So we decided to think of some next steps that could take our model further, another model further that would be helpful to determine a species or a certain amount of biomass that could best affect this canal system, or not our idealized canal system, but the actual one on the east end. And the first we went with is that the canal flow data, actually the water movement within the canal. The most accurate stuff we had is from when the weir is opening at the east end slope, but it's hard to try to figure out the effect of San Carlos Bay on the canal. We had to make assumptions from the historical data, and then we had to lower the magnitude because it's the station's on this side of a creek on the beach. It's important to figure out the influence of the water coming in and out of the canal for concentration levels, and all the effect, also for the effectiveness of the species that you decide or is decided to go with in this canal system, because a longer residence time of the water sitting in one area with these filter feeders causes that filter feeder to be more effective than it is for a tide washing it in and out, like at the opening of the inlet. Next is the canal bathymetry. The canal depth probably varies over the whole system, and the length and the width is also changing throughout the whole canal system on the east end. So, and the idealized canal system is just a constant volume that we decided to go with to start. And then also the decay and growth rates of the algal biomass, and then also including groundwater and stormwater influence into their system. Unlike what we did was only inlets and outlets from San Carlos Bay and the freshwater. So there could be more water and concentration added from runoff, from rain, and groundwater influence into your canal system as well.
Yeah, so in addition to the data, the additional data that would really sophisticate our model, we'd like to recommend potential options for pilot projects in the canal systems. So as a potential approach, oyster gardening or sponge gardening would involve the dock owners, residents, to basically suspend these cages from their structures, and this approach would hopefully spur increased community involvement and interest in the canal water quality. Also, a living seawall pilot project may be a good option. Dr. Mark Clark from the University of Florida has developed a new material that does a good job at recruiting oysters, and this material is made from jute fiber and cement. It's inexpensive, it's easy to make. These photos show pre and post recruit. Oh, I didn't. These, sorry, I lost my, these photos are, show pre and post recruitment on material over the course of 7 months. So this is pretty much an oyster reef forming from this material. So we're curious if this material can somehow be outfitted onto the canal walls and help establish a living seawall in a very inexpensive, relatively easy way. So we hope that our work from this past semester is able to help determine where in the canal these projects could potentially be implemented, and we'll move on to the policy side for a couple slides. Thank you.
So just to kind of tie this amazing work that Sydney and Matt have done to a kind of policy context and how it's useful for achieving a goal of improving water quality, our kind of overarching goal in doing this was to recommend goals, objectives, and policies focused on nature-based solutions to water quality impairment, which is exactly what Sydney and Matt have done here. Currently in the Sanibel Plan, water quality is mentioned in several contexts, such as the discussion of ecological zones and wetland protection. And as Sydney mentioned before, we understand there's been immense efforts already to improve water quality, such as the Sanibel Comprehensive Nutrient Management Plan. But again, back to kind of a similar theme from my presentation from earlier with Professor Ankerson, there is not currently a goal, objective, or policy that specifically addresses interior canal water quality, and so we think it would be beneficial and important to include that within the Sanibel Plan. So we've suggested a goal, objective, and policy to restore the water quality of Sanibel's interior canal system and of waters drained to its estuaries through nature-based solutions while protecting wildlife diversity and reducing or maintaining current pollution loading and system imbalances. And to achieve this goal, we're hoping Sydney and Matt's model and experiment is one way that the city can work towards achieving this goal. And so it would be helpful to have this language in the Sanibel Plan as aspirational language that would encourage the use of these kinds of everything that Matt and Sydney just discussed. This has been a very fun semester. I've learned a lot from Matt and Sydney about all these things, so I apologize for not being as polished on all of the science. And so, yeah, I think that's the end, so thank you.
Yeah, there are many people who have really helped us in this, so thank you. They're listed here. Sorry, go ahead.
So I've got a question.
Sure.
Have you looked into the permitting issues with this, whether you're adding it to an existing seawall? There's been companies trying to sell these habitats that you hang from your dock. I know DEP has gone back and forth on whether they will permit them. I think the fear is people put this habitat under their dock, they don't secure it, it breaks away, it drifts away, it causes pollution elsewhere.
I have not. The engineering side has not.
Yes, that honestly would be something that we would need to explore more for this to be implemented.
It's a good question. Actually, we just heard about that yesterday from the folks with WCIND, where these things actually can become hazards to navigation, and then the material that they use now, although the material that Sydney suggested from Dr. Clark is biodegradable and organic, now it's plastics. And so there's, I guess the way the WCIND people put it, there's some snake oil salesmen out there trying to promote this, and it may not be the best products that they're promoting. So it's worth thinking about that as you move forward. That's a really good question.
Yeah, thank you.
Bear with me here because I have several questions, and the reason why is I live on ground zero there.
Okay, great. I was hoping someone would.
I live on the.
What do you mean by several? Let's just clarify.
Okay. The first question I'd like to ask is in regards to the oxygen deprivation, and I've seen the use of bubblers or fountains in some other canals down in the Florida Keys. Would that be, are they effective in terms of creating more oxygen in the system?
I don't know. That's, yeah, simply put, I'm not sure. I think.
Well, yeah, I just have one sort of thought about this. So, some information that would be really useful is to really understand like the cycling of dissolved oxygen and how long these kind of low oxygen exposure periods really are. So with point sampling, you can't, you know, Eric emphasized last night in his presentation the value of continuous data, and Sydney's own work on sort of hypoxia dynamics could be really elucidating in terms of whether, you know, is there daily relief from these low oxygen conditions, or is it persistent for several weeks or months at a time that you have low oxygen? And so getting a little bit more granular with actually how severe the DO levels are, I think is first and foremost would be the first step. And then secondarily, it would be doing some additional research on, you know, the effectiveness of those types of bubblers and looking into the data that's available about those oxygenation sort of techniques and the energy efficiency of such options like that too. So.
I know also because flow is one of the main issues with these most interior portions, I've seen approaches where it's reducing the depth of those canals can help with flow, and therefore the oxygen profile may change. So I think there's engineering aspects to the canal structure too, which that's a whole nother can of worms, but there's definitely approaches to bettering it.
One of the other things that I see on the canal, which irks me quite a bit, is landscapers blowing debris into the canals. What effect does that debris have on the health of the canal system?
Yeah, I can imagine that litter is decaying, some of it anyway. If it's not flushed out into the bay, it's decaying into the canal system, and certainly adding organic matter that can be taken up by algal communities.
Last, and I apologize, I was late, so I missed some of the first presentations. But one of the issues that we have on Sanibel, and you pointed out, is that we have a golf course that basically is in the middle of our slough. Under Florida law, and if I don't have this right, please someone correct me, but the golf courses are not governed by the municipality that they're in. They're governed by the Department of Agriculture. Would it be possible for us to change that so that a municipality that had a golf course which directly was on an estuary and had such significant effect on the estuary that the municipality could have more control over that golf course?
You're asking me, huh? The answer is I don't know. It's a very good question. I really don't know what the status of what you're describing is with relationship to golf courses and the state statutes. That would be called preemption, where the state has preempted from the local government the authority to regulate in some way, shape, or manner, and that's what you're describing. I don't know the extent to which that exists in the case of golf courses in particular. If that were the case, then you would have to change the statute, or change the statute and get some sort of special exception for Sanibel or for some particular type of golf course and so forth. So that would require legislation. But we will definitely look into it. It's an interesting question.
I am wondering, I see an elephant in the room here, and you made reference to it when you said to reduce the level of water in the canals. Is it possible that we may have to solve this problem, we may have to shut down several of the canals in the coming years and just fill them in. And is that one of your recommendations, or one of the what?
He's not a voter.
Yes, I'm not a boater.
No,
I'd be curious, because it seems to me, as you said, you're saying maybe reducing the water level will help with the oxygenation. Maybe eliminating the canals in certain parts of the East End would do the same thing.
Well,
Or maybe not eager to write one, but his.
well,
no, yeah. Oh,
yeah, go ahead and answer.
I'll say that I was not explicitly recommending that. I think that for improving canal water quality, we're really focused on essentially what's being brought from the slough to the canals, and also using the nature-based solutions like the filter feeders to improve them. If there's options for engineering more structurally, then I think they should be considered. But yeah, otherwise, I don't think, yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
Then we could start talking about takings in a different context.
Yeah.
But I mean, one thing that the idea of it sparked my interest too, actually, is it may be that the canals are more than deep enough for the boats that use those canals, and therefore it may be possible that you reduce the depth and then you increase the flow and light to the bottom, which is important too. So that's just a thought. That would be the engineering solution Sydney recommended.
Yeah, and I'll just mention, from the Sanibel Slough standpoint, I think there's some opportunities to improve habitat, in creating, more vegetation along the slough, so we're treating, doing a much better job of treating the water that's coming out of the slough system. And I know the city of Sanibel, Ding Darling, and SECF, we've been looking at opportunities to expand that habitat along the Sanibel Slough. And I think there's some real opportunities for bigger, larger scale projects in the future. So that will help. But when it comes to the shorelines, or the canal system, the more we can encourage the use of mangroves, living shorelines, and these other filter feeders, I think that's going to help. But I just had one quick question. You considered sponges, clams, and oysters, but did you consider tunicates or sea squirts or any of those other filter feeders that have been tested somewhat? And I know there's a number of people in the East End Canal system that have reef structures, although not permitted by the city of Sanibel, hanging under their docks that are full of tunicates and probably doing a pretty good job of filter feeding. I'm just curious of what your thoughts are on those organisms.
Yeah, no, we did not consider them, but I know that they can be quite prevalent, barnacles, and yeah, so that would be, I'm interested in what's in the literature there, because although they seem quite small, I think that they could, in like a net consideration, they could be quite impactful. So anyway, I won't say much more than that, but I do think that some digging in the literature would be a good start. Thanks.
Okay, if I have one more, I was going to give it to Carrie. Is that all right? Yeah, we'll have time afterward. We can chat.
So this is actually just a couple comments, and Sydney, I've actually talked to a little bit about this because I used to study oyster clearance, and so I just wanted to kind of tap into a couple things that you guys were talking about and add to the point that was just made. So one thing that I think policy-wise might be important to consider, I think this would be on our radar anyway, but also to consider if you were to do these pilot projects, really carefully also considering where you're sourcing your filter feeders from. And part of why I say that is because when I studied oysters in a system in St. Augustine, some of the pre-existing models around how much they filter basically said they wouldn't filter at all in the conditions that we had out there, like how turbid it was. Mm-hmm. And so it could point to two different kind of prongs there. I think one is that, it's hard to characterize filter feeding and to really understand, how all the conditions feed into that. but also that you've got such different conditions for these filter feeders. Like for oysters, you've got subtidal oysters, you've got tidal oysters. So much like we think about like the source of fish, if we're using them to supplement natural systems, you'd want to probably think about where your filter feeders are coming from, because you want ones that are really adapted to the conditions here. And the other comment I was going to make about the tunicates and some of those pieces, the tricky part when I kind of left reading this literature, so I don't know where it's gone since then, but I think that's the interesting thing about oysters too, and it may be about some of these other filter feeders, is that you start to get in some of those tunicates and mussels and even porcelain crabs that filter feed will start to actually come into some of those like oyster systems. And so then you get this added benefit of these other filter feeders, but the hard part is there's not a lot of literature that's actually said, okay, we get these other amazing things that move into these oyster systems, and really understanding how they're contributing to filter feeding. So I think there's pieces we don't know, but there's a lot of really interesting components there.
Thank you, Carrie. Great.
Okay, well, I think, that wasn't a question, so we'll give you your question.
I'm one who asks a lot of questions, obviously, but I want to ask a completely think out of the box. If you look at the way our canal system is, and considering that I'm looking at the College of Engineering here, is there an engineering solution where you could possibly take another point of tidal flow and add it to the canal system? Would it be possible to, for instance, the Beach Road Canal is really not that far from San Carlos. If you were to draw a line right down Bailey Road, you would reach the San Carlos Bay, probably in less than, I'd say, maybe a mile. Would that affect, is it, forget about if it's doable or not, if it was doable, would that enhance our canal system?
I think you would have less high levels of concentration in that back end of the canal. So it wouldn't be all located where these high levels were all located in that back end, because it's most closely to that freshwater slough. And I think part of it is because a lot of the water kind of stops there. It doesn't have, and I don't exactly know how the system is built, but if there was underground piping, I thought regionally, like connecting all the systems, it might have less concentration in certain areas, but it doesn't reduce like contaminant amount in your canal system, I think.
At the very least, I think it's clear that the hydrology would be changed entirely throughout the whole canal if there was another inlet influencing the system. So yeah, that would bring about a whole different profile of these environmental parameters we've been considering. But in what way, I don't think we can really say.
Yeah, and that's the big engineering solution. They're talking about that in Indian River Lagoon, opening up a whole new inlet in order to get that thing flushing, because it's been so compromised by the upland activities.
I would just be real hesitant about flushing.
Because of careful what you ask for?
When you flush bad water into good water, you're not really helping the situation.
Yeah.
The cleanest water in my house is in the toilet bowl after I flush it. So,
well, after I
eliminating the pollution is really, I think, the goal.
Yeah.
Yes, I think so too. And just on James's point, I think from the interior all the way through the system is the approach to take. Putting up as much out of nature-based infrastructure, so you get the environmental benefits, but also the chemistry benefits in terms of improvements in water quality. I think all the way through the system.
One thing I'll tell you that many of these students, particularly our PhD students, are now thinking about these questions in terms of their larger PhD dissertation projects. So there will be some follow-up in that sense from the science standpoint. Let's go ahead and move on. We have one more, and we're on time.
We're nearing the end, so hi everyone, my name is Kelly Graham. I'm a third-year law student at the University of Florida, and I'm joined by my colleagues.
I'm Nick Chin. I'm a first-year PhD student in the School of Environmental Engineering at the University of Florida.
Hi everyone, my name is Sarah Koppetman. I am a second-year law student, and thank
thank you all for being here and sticking it out until the very bittersweet end.
So our project has primarily been working with the Captiva Erosion Prevention District, looking at sea level rise and various forms of coastal management practices, along with the legal authority that the district may have to implement these practices. So in this presentation, we'll discuss the interest in expanding resiliency measures on Captiva Island, the legal authority to implement these measures, and then move into applying sea level rise predictions and some nature-based solutions on the island. We'll close out with funding opportunities for the CEPD and examples of some resiliency efforts elsewhere. So I'll start just with a brief overview and explanation of independent special districts and the CEPD. So independent special districts act as an extension of local government. They operate within a limited geographic boundary to carry out a special purpose, and they're created by general law, special act, local ordinance, or rule of the governor and cabinet. And they operate within the Uniform Special District Accountability Act of 1989, and this was passed to provide a uniform provision for special district definitions, creations, elections, and other specificities. And then the CEPD specifically operates as an independent special district, a beach and shore preservation district, and it was established in 1959 under Chapter 161 of the Florida Statutes. And it's governed by independently elected district board with broad powers to do as necessary or desirable to carry out the CEPD comprehensive beach and shore preservation program. So as part of our project, we interviewed CEPD board members for their opinions on expanding coastal resiliency efforts, and all interviewed members showed a strong interest in expanding resiliency on the island, especially on the bay side, the more lower energy side of the island. And these members believe the enabling legislation would grant them authority for these efforts. So now I'll turn it over to Sarah to discuss this legal authority.
So as Kelly mentioned, the board wanted to engage in more resiliency efforts, and luckily they do have that legal authority to do that. So Kelly and I, as the law students, what we did was we read through the enabling legislation and we tried to find which sections would grant them that authority. And we found that this section on the PowerPoint slide, section 4, paragraph 6, gave them probably the broadest authority to engage in some of these resiliency efforts. So under this section, they have the authority to create and execute a program for comprehensive beach and shore preservation. And under the definition of beach and shore preservation, it's defined in a separate Florida statute. It includes all of these things like erosion control, coastal flood control, shoreline and offshore rehabilitation, and the regulation of work and activities that are likely to affect the physical condition of the beaches. So that is clearly very broad authority. So for example, Captiva, the CEPD, could do some seagrass restoration or oyster reef restoration as part of offshore rehabilitation. And they can also engage in nature-based solutions over multi-parcel, over several parcels to level up the shoreline. And there's a separate section that also explains their jurisdiction. So their jurisdiction extends 300 feet out from the mean high tide line. So they could do seagrass restoration or oyster reef restoration up to 300 feet out from that mean high tide line. And they also have the authority to exercise jurisdiction and control over any kind of erosion prevention project. So if a homeowner wanted to do dune restoration, for example, the CEPD could come up with rules regarding what kind of species of dunes they want to use or how exactly they would implement that plan, since that would constitute an erosion prevention activity, since we know that dunes are good at capturing sand within their roots. So now I'll turn it over, well, now that we know that the CEPD has this authority to engage in multi-parcel nature-based solutions to sea level rise, I'll turn it over to Nick, who's going to explain what exactly this looks like and how it can be implemented.
So yeah, we ended up running a spatial analysis of Captiva Island over 2 time frames, really, using NOAA's medium predictions. And these predictions were made in 2017. And in future plots, you'll kind of see some of the inundation predictions that we had made based off of what is the medium, higher high water levels, which is basically the average highest tide that you'd experience every day. So the first bit of plots we're going to show is 2040, what the predictions for that are, which represent 1 foot of sea level rise, and 2070, which represents 2 feet of sea level rise. So, you know, just this is a really, as far as the time frame goes, this is really close. I mean, 2040 is 20 years, and 2070 is another 30 years on top of that. So these are solutions that really need to be implemented in the near future. Again, this analysis was done using elevation and bathymetry data and a combination of data sets from NOAA and then using ArcGIS for some of the analysis. So first off, I really wanted to highlight what the current shoreline status is of Captiva Island, with 3 major types, one being natural shoreline and mangroves, the second being sand and beaches, and then the third being seawall and riprap, which accounts to about 100,000 linear feet. The green represents the mangrove and natural shoreline, the pink represents seawall, and the orange represents sand. And so you can really see how heterogeneous of a shoreline this island has. So now I kind of want to get into those actual scenarios I'd highlighted before. And again, one of the assumptions or things that is not included in this is how the actual shoreline, current shoreline would stand up against these inundation scenarios, just because we don't know the height of all the seawalls and things like that. So again, this is just purely based off bathymetry and elevation data. So this is one of the images of what is pretty indicative of residential areas on Captiva Island. The blue, again, representing what that higher high tidal influence will have on some of these areas. And as you can see, it's pretty dire flooding for a lot of these areas in that 1 foot scenario, where you can see the blue or that predicted flooding really starting to creep into this person's property. So that's site 1 that I wanted to highlight with the 1 foot of sea level rise. And under this scenario, 12 structures are predicted to be affected during these high tide events. When looking at some of the shoreline scenario, what the current shoreline breakdown is of this area, we can see that a lot of these areas are lawns and again residential areas. But as far as these high-risk areas, another location I want to highlight was the South Seas Resort. And again, this is an important property because we know how valuable tourism is to the island. And we can see from this image what the inundation would do to this area. Really starting to creep into a lot of the recreational areas and actual rooms of this resort. So now moving on to figure B, which is the 2 foot scenario, or 2 feet of sea level rise scenario, which is estimated to be about the year 2070. And in the year 2070, the estimates become much more dire, and we estimate that over 90 structures would be affected by this 2 feet of sea level rise scenario, with a very heterogeneous shoreline delineation. So mangroves, seawalls, ripraps, all these regions would be would be affected by this 2 foot sea level rise scenario. And we can see in this image that multiple blocks are actually going to be inundated during this high tide. So speaking of the South Seas Resort, another really valuable site that I wanted to highlight was the wastewater treatment plant, which kind of lays on one of the barrier islands in the northern part of Captiva. And we can see here on that island, almost the entire thing becomes flooded in that scenario. So for the actual area that we predict to be flooded in 2040 and 2070, by the year 2040, about 65 acres are predicted to be affected that currently have a natural shoreline or mangroves. And by 2070, we expect that number to go up to about 101 acres. Areas with seawall and riprap in 2040, we expect about 2 acres to go to about 7 acres in 2070. And beach, we expect it to stay about the same. And again, this is just the eastern part of the island that we're talking about, not the western part that's mostly just beach. So the next part, I just wanted to show a possible solution maybe to this problem and what the island could look like if we, if Captive Island decides to go with an engineering solution utilizing more seawall and living shoreline. And like some of my colleagues had alluded to before, the living shoreline is really just this utilization of nature-based solutions to prevent erosion and help prevent some of the flooding that would occur on the island. And so the most suitable areas for the living shoreline is the middle part of the island, where it's it's not as tidally influenced and is referred to more as like a low energy shoreline, alongside with the more gradual sloping of the middle part of Captive Island. Unlike the northern and southern regions, which are more tidally influenced, have a much deeper channel, and probably would not be as advantageous to build a living shoreline. So the first image is figure A is the current day shoreline delineation with, again, the mangrove, riprap, seawall, very heterogeneous as far as what the island currently has. And figure B is this possible solution to a more homogeneous breakdown of shoreline, building more seawall, implementing much more living shoreline, being the green in figure B, where that South Seas Resort wastewater treatment plant is, to prevent future shoreline erosion and to mitigate some of the effects of sea level rise. The second image, or the second slide, is the same kind of analysis for the southern part of the island, taking advantage of what kind of seawall is currently in place, and possibly leveling that up and extending it to more of the southern part of the island. Again, to reiterate that that is a higher energy part of the island as far as tides, and would probably, it would probably be necessary to have a more engineered structure in an area like that. So just to kind of show like what that kind of breakdown would do as far as the amount of each of these shorelines that we've proposed, you would end up having about 40,000 linear feet of living shoreline, 27,000 feet of beach and sand, and then the big one, you'd end up going from about 9,700 feet to 31,000 feet of seawall. And I will pass it back over to Kelly.
Thank you. So apart from kind of the short memo on legal authority that Sarah and I are working on, Sarah and I are also currently working on a white paper that's analyzing the new Florida Resiliency Statute, which Katie has already addressed, our colleague, which was approved by Governor DeSantis in May of this year. So the statute's main purpose is to combat adverse impacts from flooding in Florida due to frequency of rainfall events, storm surges, severe weather systems, and sea level rise. And the statute establishes the Resilient Florida Grant Program within the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, and it provides grants and funding to local governments, regional resilience entities, water management districts, and flood control districts. But as you can see, the statute does not mention independent special districts, including districts such as the CEPD, even though many of these districts in Florida are currently working on resiliency projects or soon to be working on these projects. And even more so, I wanted to highlight what a great funding opportunity this would be if special districts were included. The Resilient Florida program provides $1 billion in funding over 4 years, every 4 years, and provides grants to projects addressing the impacts of sea level rise, intensified storms, and localized flooding. So in our paper, we provided an overview of the statute. We've raised the question as to why the statute does not include independent special districts in its funding of resiliency efforts, and kind of are working on efforts to amend it.
So it would be really great if they included independent special districts, because then the CEPD could apply for funding and actually fund some of these
things that Nick was talking about and implement these models into actual action. But to bolster our argument that these districts should be included, we wanted to figure out around how many independent special districts are actually already engaged in these efforts. So Kelly and I, we went to the Florida Department of Economic Opportunities website, and they have this tool that lets you look at all of the independent special districts and filter them based on just different criteria. So that's, oh my God, that's really tiny. Well, you can't see it, but it's a screenshot of that website, and basically we filtered it by selecting independent, and because there's also dependent special districts, but we only wanted to look at independent, so we selected independent, and of course, active districts. We only want to look at the active ones. So we generated that list, and then essentially read through a lot of their enabling legislations to see exactly what they're allowed to do, what they're charged to do. So if we saw something indicating that they were involved in some sort of inland or coastal resiliency, then we added that into our list, and we tallied up that around 187 of these districts are already engaged in coastal and inland resiliency, and therefore give them money, essentially. So these are some of the districts that we found. There's beach and shore preservation districts, there's drainage and water control districts, port facilities, and soil and water conservation districts, and of course, like Captiva is also, the CEPD, Erosion Prevention District, is also included in that list. It's a big list, that's only a few of them on there, but there's many of them. So this is a policy argument, essentially, and this is what we're putting in our white paper as to why these districts should be included. And another reason is that counties are included for funding, but counties, there's no guarantee that a county will apply for the independent special districts that are housed within that county. They may decide, not to do that, and that's perfectly fine under the statute. So these independent special districts should have their own ability to apply on their behalf and should not have to rely on the county. I mean, they're an independent district, why should they have to do that? So that's one of the main arguments.
Yeah, so as Sarah mentioned, the statute would ideally include these independent special districts because the county doesn't have to apply for funding on their behalf. And for the CEPD, which has its own special taxing authority, it'd be very beneficial for the Florida statute because it could match its funds. And then looking at the legislative intent, another kind of statutory argument, it just makes sense to include special districts as it furthers the purpose of why they passed this statute in the first place. So as you can see, and Sarah has gone through, there's a lot of potential examples of independent special districts focused on resiliency just in the Florida area, but we've also included examples elsewhere in our white paper. So I won't go through all of them here, but some notable examples of resiliency work can be found in New Orleans. They have a resiliency district that was granted funding just in 2020 to work on stormwater, green and blue corridors, and adaptation plans to deal with flooding and sea level rise. Portland, Oregon also adopted an advisory commission to deal with resilience districts and post-disaster situations from earthquakes and tsunamis. Seattle, Washington, they're working on setting up an independent special resiliency district in the downtown area especially to deal with the pollution issues they face and river flooding. And then Virginia Beach is also facing sea level rise and flooding issues, and they've established a long-term resilience as a policy strategy, and it's included in their city master plan. And then finally, just to highlight an even more recent effort for resiliency, Connecticut's also working on establishing a resilience board, and their proposed bill allows erosion control boards to apply for and use public or private grant funding, as well as enter into contracts with municipalities. And we really wanted to highlight this example because the functions they propose are similar to the ones CEPD is grappling with, allowing boards to include flood prevention and climate resilience in their programming and planning how they would operate these systems, and including the nature-based solutions Nick has talked about, and create some open space for future accommodations.
So we would just like to briefly conclude the Captiva Erosion Prevention District is more than just an erosion prevention district. They have really broad authority to develop nature-based solutions to sea level rise and climate change. Hopefully, we've given them a springboard and some models to look at that'll give them some ideas as to what they can do in the future. And more of a bigger goal is to get them funding, but we're still working on that. But that was all, so if you have any questions.
well, guess I gotta take the mic.
I have a modeling question, and I've been very curious about the different modelings that are available and tools online. My big question with them is, are they taking into account the water movement in the soil underneath as well as what's going to be moving up? Because that, I think, is a huge issue.
Yes. Yeah, very good. Yeah, I mean, I would argue that the saltwater intrusion from the flooding is probably the biggest, one of the biggest variables you have to deal with as far as these engineering solutions. Because yeah, you can build your seawall higher and higher and higher for these 1-2 foot scenarios, but if you're not actually leveling up a lot of your properties and stuff, you're gonna end up with salt water in your property. And so no, actually, yeah, that certainly wasn't part of the analysis we ran, but it does highlight as far as like how much we expect the water level to move up and just the head level. And so when an eventual engineering design is proposed, that would include things like fill and a lot more of the actual bottom infrastructure to deal with the saltwater intrusion. So yeah, that's a great observation and question.
All those people are from Sanibel. Why do they care about Captiva, right? I think this guy is from Captiva.
Hey, good morning. I'm actually the Technical Policy Director for CEPD. So I just want to echo that I'm very excited that you all are looking into the funding availability to allow independent special districts to apply for funding, because that's one of the roadblocks we ran into this year. So I just kudos and thank you for looking into that.
Yeah, in fact, the little policy short, as we called it, that we wrote is being used now in Tallahassee. The Florida Beaches and Shores Preservation Association, which represents a lot of those special districts that Sarah referred to, is actively pursuing changing the statute. It was probably an oversight, but it's hard to know, what happens in Tallahassee and why. I guess we'll find out if it passes or not, if they amend the statute. And then the executive director of the CEPD, Jennifer Nelson, couldn't be here today, but she wants us to present this to their board once exams are over, just for your purposes, because that's where we're going next. So any more questions? So yeah, I'm sure we're tired at this point, but in terms of next steps for us, so there's 3 deliverables that the students are responsible for. One of which you've seen, which is the PowerPoint presentation, and that was obviously the focus moving up to this presentation. There's a paper that will be associated with it, a final paper which will be formatted, footnoted, and all that sort of thing, and available. And then a poster that all of which we will provide to the SCCF for their continuing use. And as I said, some of the students are very interested in taking this research to the next level as we move on. So with that, I want to thank you, and I want everybody to thank the students for all the hard work.